First, this 4-point plan, I want to run you through each of your points and get you to explain. The first might seem obvious, David, but you say Boris needs to start telling the truth.
Well, I don't think it's good if he appears to be a serial liar. And I think that Boris needs to square with the British people. I mean, Boris has got one of Boris' most remarkable gifts is people like him, or they have done in the past.
Yeah.
They think he's got charisma. He reaches out. He reaches parts that other politicians don't reach, in the sense that he is. He seems to be a normal member of the human race, and that allowed him, for instance, in his 2 terms as mayor of London, to be able to get to what was basically, and has been for some time now, London, a Labour city, and to get elected twice. But that has to depend on squaring up to people and giving them the truth. And I think with Boris, there is a suggestion somehow that he is quite happy to say the first thing that comes into his head if he thinks it's plausible, and he's not so bothered about whether it's truthful. So I think if he loses his reputation for truth, then it will fall apart for him. And that's what happened, for instance. My memory of politics goes back more than half a century. Harold Wilson, who, was had an even bigger election victory in 1966 than Boris ever did. But the public soon became very disillusioned with Harold Wilson. And, the old joke was, how do you know when Harold Wilson is lying? And the answer was his lips move.
Yeah. And I don't think we're quite there with Boris, but you're right. If that becomes the overwhelming view, that's an issue. You also say he needs to change the lightweight people around him. And this is something a lot of senior Tories, we had Michael Patillo on the show on Thursday, are saying, Boris, you've got to hire some heavyweights.
Well, I think the problem, look, once again, to draw a practical example, I many years ago knew Ronald Reagan quite well. Ronald Reagan goes down as a great American president.
Absolutely.
Because he was Uncle Sam. He was someone that it was very difficult to dislike. And he played to the strengths of the American system, which a lot of presidents couldn't do, because the president is the head of state. He's not just a political leader. But Ronald Reagan was able to do that because he had behind him people of weight and substance. So the broad brush that Ronald Reagan brought to politics was supplemented and augmented by a lot of detailed work done by heavyweights behind him. Problem for Boris is that he doesn't have heavyweights around him in number 10. I mean, that nonsense, Allegra Stratton, putting onto a film that anyone could then dig out to embarrass her, humiliate her, actually, and embarrass the government, about joking about not telling the truth about having these parties. That is childish. That is student politics. It's not real politics. And then you get the problem even worse with members of the cabinet. I mean, one of the other things I quoted in my piece was Willie Whitelaw. I was a protege of Willie Whitelaw's. Willie Whitelaw was Margaret Thatcher's deputy, and he used to stand up to her and tell her what she needed to know. And she once famously said, "Everyone needs a Willie." Well, Willie Whitelaw was, her Willie. But when you look at who he's got, who Boris has got, his deputy is Dominic Raab. Well, does everyone need a Raab? Does anyone need a Raab? I mean, we're talking about different levels of people. Yeah. Boris cannot be a lightweight if he doesn't have heavyweights behind him.
Yeah, indeed. And you also say that the other 2 things he has to do is actually allow folk, his stars, you might say, like Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss, to take more of the spotlight, and also not be scared to anoint a successor. Explain why you think that's important.
Well, I don't know that he needs to anoint a successor as such, but I think that he seems to think that as long as there's no obvious successor, he is safe. But of course, once again, in my piece, digging back into history, another notorious old Etonian Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, was brought down by a fellow old Etonian who quoted an ancient poem, which ended up with the immortal words, "Never glad, confident morning again." It was called The Lost Leader. And that devastated Macmillan. And it was one of the great moments in parliamentary history. The House of Commons was transformed by this, transfixed by it, because the question we all have to ask, Macmillan had to ask the question, could it ever be glad, confident morning again for him? And it couldn't. And with Boris, can it be glad, confident morning again for him? He mustn't depend on the fact there wasn't an obvious successor to him, because Harold Macmillan, there was no obvious successor to Harold Macmillan, and they had to go and dig into the House of Lords to take out Alec Hume, Lord Hume, and he had to become a commoner, go into the House of Commons as a by-election. This is all stuff that isn't really, it was no protection. So he needs to have around him strong people. A leader need never be afraid of strong support. It's a weak leader who is afraid of strong support.
And finally, Dave, do you believe that Boris Johnson can remain leader and win the next election?
Well, I don't think you can write Boris off, because he's a charismatic guy. And, to go back to old jokes, forgive me, a moment to recycle old jokes, but for a lot of politicians today, they think charisma is December the 25th, don't they? But Boris Johnson is a charismatic politician. But what he cannot appear to be is a dishonest, deceitful politician. He has also to have strong principles, things he believes in. And I think one of Boris's weaknesses that I don't think he's really a conservative. That's his problem. A conservative does not believe in high taxation. Boris has now taken the percentage of the national wealth that is consumed by the state to the highest level for 70 years. That's not what a conservative politician does. And that's why I think he needs to bring forward people who are conservative. I think Rishi Sunak is a conservative. I also think, although there are plenty of people who think she herself is a bit of a lightweight,